is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the Miller Lecture of this week, which is Dr. Jeff Easton, who is an assistant professor of classics at Southwestern University, which I hear is in Texas. And Jeffrey completed his PhD at the University of Toronto, where he also lectured, and other stops on his academic journey include a Mellon postdoc at Washington and Lee University, and also stays at the American Academy in Rome and at the British School at Rome, which I actually happen to know very well. So yeah, I'm sure you had lovely stays there. So Jeffrey specializes in what could be described as sub-elite populations in the Roman Empire, social mobility, Roman slavery, and especially aspects of manumission, seen, I understand, very closely through the method of epigraphy, so the study of Roman inscriptions. And he has published a string of studies on these themes, including a monograph on municipal freedmen, which was published by Brill in last year, in 2024. And we will be hearing an aspect of his research entitled Keeping it in the Familia, Navigating the Associative Milieu in Ancient Rome. And we're very, very pleased to have you here and looking forward to your paper. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for the great introduction, and thank you to the center. And I'm really pleased to see lots of people out there, and a special thanks also to Jan for all of his patience and getting things organized on your end from the technical side of things. Okay, so I want to. I hope people don't mind. I'm going to largely read my paper, but I'll try to keep it a bit more lively. So I want to begin my presentation in medias res. On the slide, I show you here the actual stone where we have a stone. I like to show the image, and then here's the text in English translation. And then for those of you who with some Latin and want to dig into the details, I give the text below. On the slide, you see a typical inscribed tombstone from a small town in central Italy called Cypinum. The text records 3 generations of a family, but on the surface it looks like thousands of other examples from across the Roman Empire and runs the risk of relegation to the category of just names on a tombstone. But for the student of Roman social history, with the right methodological tools, a close reading actually uncovers a rich story of social and economic mobility, a micro-history of this single family and the community where they lived. Now, the first thing to note here, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of the game, and that's by design. The first thing you'll notice here is that the individuals involved carry a family name, Cypinius, which specifically relates to the name of the town. This is an indication that a person had been enslaved by the town, or now a freed person, or that they are the child or descendant of one. And then individuals with only a single name as a sort of very general rule of thumb. So like the dedicant here, Oriens, is most likely still enslaved, and we can assume here by the town. Now, I'm going to dig into more of this material shortly, but one of the things I wanted to draw our attention to here is that the patriarch of the family, who is the primary dedicatee, Lucius Cypinius Oriens, he had been enslaved by the town and was granted his freedom through manumission. He eventually made good, and he even attained a very high rank, in as much as formerly enslaved people were able to attain as a member of the Augustales, as a very prestigious local association. The older son, who's also called Oriens, and you see him down here in the nominative, Oriens Alimentarius, he is still enslaved by the town, and he's working in an accounting role in the town treasury. The younger son, who is the second dedicand, is Lucius Cypinius Orestes, and he is freeborn, and we know this for various reasons, and he apparently had a full civic life, and he was elected to the senior magistracy in his one of the two senior magistracies in his town. Therefore, he joined the rank of the local elite. Now, I like to show this example first because this is one of the most extraordinary examples of social mobility within this Roman system. To make the trek from enslaved to local elite in just 2 generations in a family is really quite remarkable. So literally this document here touches on opposite ends of the Roman social and legal spectrum all at one time. And for those of you who think more schematically, here's a little family tree, if you will, of this particular group. And the star here, this is the younger Oriens, who is actually the dedicator of this whole thing. Now, a slight spoiler alert here. Despite its impressiveness, this family's success was not very common among their peers in the lower ranks of Roman society. Yet, these sorts of cases often tend to carry an outsized importance in the discussions of social mobility in this period, and I'll return to this in a little bit. As this example signals, I want to talk today about the topic of upward social and economic mobility among subaltern families in ancient Rome. Or more precisely, I want to talk about the limits of social mobility in a rigidly stratified society like Rome, which is characterized by a high degree of asymmetrical dependency at every step of the socioeconomic and political hierarchy, with its clientelist structure and binaries such as patron-client, master-enslaved, and patron-freed, just to name a few. Specifically, I want to take you through one of the main case studies from the aforementioned book that helps us to reassess mainstream scholarly ideas about how social mobility was supposed to have worked in Roman society. We will analyze a group of Romans who had a far greater social distance to cover than others, namely families of enslaved and emancipated men and women from the same background as these Scipinnii. They're known in our sources as servi publici or servi publicae, and generally are distinguished by the shorthand public or municipal slaves, and then we also have municipal freedmen and freedwomen. Their bid to establish social ties and pursue avenues for economic ascent embraces many of the broader questions scholars have about all sub-elite families, but their value as a heuristic tool in this particular context has long been overlooked. In this presentation, I want to explore how these families navigated the rigid social, economic, and legal landscape of Roman society, and through which avenues they pursued meaningful civic engagement and sought to carve out an identity within the wider community. Now, I want to also very quickly preface with 2 points of terminology. The terms elite and sub-elite, those of you in specifically the field, these have become technical terms in Roman social history and should not be taken as valuative terms. As you can imagine, neither the elite nor the sub-elite were monolithic groups. Lots of socioeconomic and ethnic diversity existed within these categories. Broadly speaking, for my purposes, the elite refer to the senatorial and equestrian classes that formed the aristocracy of the Roman Empire, while the sub-elite label indicates Romans of varying socioeconomic and legal statuses who rank below the equestrians. In addition, I follow the practice of employing the proper terminology of enslaved person rather than slave. The latter has a connotation of a sort of natural state or a sort of perverse occupational title, while the former underscores that the enslaved person was forcibly brought under this socio-legal status. When I do use terms like municipal slave or municipal freedman or freedwomen, I'm reflecting something very specific in a translation of the material. Okay. So the group that I'll be dealing with consists of enslaved men and women who were owned not by private individuals, but corporately by communities throughout Italy and the Roman Empire. Towns were counted as collective bodies under Roman law, and therefore they could also manumit the enslaved people, producing municipal freedmen and freedwomen. And many of these individuals who were granted their freedom actually stuck around the town. Together with the enslaved members, the freedmen in each town made up an official organization called the Familia Publica, or the public household, the public family. There is evidence for a Familia Publica in some 60 towns, both large and small, so we can assume that most communities probably had one to some degree. For this exercise, I'm taking a very broad view of the Familia Publica, as in assuming that there are certain elements of similarity across the board, and I'm taking a very synchronic perspective on the evidence for various reasons. So in previous and in my own research, some 300 servi publici and about 250 liberti publici have been identified in various inscriptions from Italy, the provinces. And my own work has identified thus far nearly 600 descendants of these particular groups. Now, I'm not going to get very far into the technicalities of how I try to separate out the municipal freedmen, municipal slaves themselves from the descendants. So if anybody would like to ask about that later on, that would be great. But for now, I'll just leave it at that. But as I said, this group is pretty robust in the epigraphic evidence, and that actually means that this is one of the better documented enslaved groups that we know about from the entire Roman world. And this I'm here on the third part of my slide here. The enslaved individuals bore nomenclature like this first person, Herennius, coloniae emeritensis servus, from Augusta Merita in western Spain. And like all manumitted slaves, the freedmen and freedwomen were entitled to the 2 or 3 names borne by Roman citizens. Privately manumitted freedmen took the nomenclature of their former enslaver turned patron as part of their pseudo-filial relationship. But since municipal freedmen specifically had been owned by the town itself, they acquired their family name, which is called the gentilicium, from the town itself. And so one finds freedmen with names like Quintus Ostiensis Felix from Ostia, and freed women like Terventinia Calliste from Terventum. Some towns gave their formerly enslaved people the generic gentilicium, Publicius or Publicia, which is not terribly creative, but this is a very Roman thing to do, which declared that the person was the son or the daughter of the public. And so in terms of the social milieu of the time, but also for researchers, these sorts of names are a kind of indirect but enduring reminder of this person's origins, and it makes, in some ways, from a methodological tool, it's very important. The familia's existence was in many ways modeled on the enslaved households of private owners and of the Roman emperor, but there were some notable differences. Among those members we can trace in the epigraphic evidence, we know that in their official role, they mostly performed a range of day-to-day services for the municipal administration, from managing city workshops and rural territory to clerical and accounting work. Some were engaged in very high-level work, performing skilled occupations and associating with local aristocrats who held offices and managed the different administrative bureaus. In exchange for their high-level work, some of the enslaved must have received a substantial stipend, which is called a peculium, with which they could act as civic benefactors or purchase their own sub-enslaved people called vicarii. But being in a top familia public occupation may also have offered the chance to forge informal links to municipal authority that could be turned into social capital. Turning to the freedmen and freedwomen, we also see that they routinely continued to work in some capacity with the Familia Publica, perhaps with some sort of promotion. They occupied an ambiguous status. On the one hand, since the Familia consisted of an impersonal form of slavery, at the moment of manumission, the freedmen lacked a personal enslaver turned patron. This is a big deal in Roman society. Privately manumitted freedmen could rely on their personal patron to provide a ready-made clientela network, numerous social and financial benefits, and a push up the civic ladder. On the other hand, these new freedmen might be able to cash in on whatever personal wealth, social capital, and relationships that accrued while enslaved to give themselves an independent boost as they entered the economy as free citizens. The few scholars who have explored their post-manumission lives assume, based on a rather limited number of often cited case studies, that these benefits offset the lack of a patron. Scholars generally assume that the municipal freedmen had an inside track into coveted civic circles, like membership in associations in their communities, and therefore had an easier time in placing their families on the escalator of social mobility, if you will. Now, I want to digress just for a quick second here and talk a little bit about associations, just that so everybody has kind of a sense of the importance of this in the background of my case study. So I mentioned before that one of the key indicators of social mobility we are able to track in our evidence is participation in this world of associations. These associations, called collegia or corpora in Latin, are often characterized as either professional, trade, or voluntary associations. They formed around things like common business or occupational interests, cultic veneration of a particular local deity, or even funerary clubs. And they often tended to be populated by individuals from the lower tiers of Roman society, including freeborn plebeians and current and formerly enslaved people. It must be underscored that it took money and social connections to get into one of these groups. We know a good deal about associations and their membership because of their eager participation in self-commemoration and inscriptions. And cities and towns, anybody who studies this material, cities and towns across the empire were replete with different types of associations, and this is especially true of Italy and the West. So much so that the historian Conrad Verboven has coined the phrase the associative milieu to describe this system. Now, aside from sorting out precisely what animated a particular group to form and reconstructing how they operate under the Roman law, recent research has reasserted the fundamental role that urban associations played in structuring civic and economic life as an institutional link between the elite and the sub-elite. They had a far greater function than just occupational meetups or something akin to medieval guilds or modern trade unions. For one, the system offered to lower class members a sense of community and met their needs for collegial life all in one place. For example, they had this multivalent function that included facilitating economic connections among members, offering a calendar of exclusive and public dining events, and providing for members funerary rituals. Being in one of these groups and being seen to participate gave one a civic identity they were unlikely to secure all on their own. Additionally, associations gave their most prominent members an approximation of a public career and an opportunity for civic distinction. For the most part, the men and women who occupied these groups would never be able to join the elite members of a community who dominated the local councils and held the public offices. But these associations created their own internal hierarchy, modeled on the official town administration, complete with offices, bylaws, and outlets for civic benefaction. In turn, the town elite developed a sort of economy of honors within the associative milieu that harnessed the wealth and ambitions of upwardly mobile associates who sought greater civic recognition. So prominent collegiati could engage in the same types of sort of civic benefaction that we see elites doing. And again, this is a major part of our evidence from the local context. In addition to basking in their personal glory, our evidence suggests that these up-and-comers were equally eager to push their family name into the public eye in hopes that their grandsons or descendants might one day be able to secure a seat on the local council. This outlet for civic interaction was particularly coveted by freedmen, and this was essential for their families to make their mark. Because of their previous enslavement, they were legally prohibited from sitting in the council or holding office, regardless of their wealth and status, but their freeborn sons and grandsons were in theory eligible for a full career. Now, I think we'll see shortly why I spent a few minutes here talking about the associations. Come back here to our primary group. Yeah. So returning to the Familia Publica, despite the scholarly status quaestionis that the municipal, enslaved, and freed members were destined for success, a closer examination of the full range of available evidence tells a far more nuanced story. Some municipal slaves and freedmen did leverage their material and symbolic resources into participation in this local associative life, and had some wider success in those venues. But by and large, they did not succeed all that often. And it is essential to remember that the enslaved and freed Familia Publica members we can track in the evidence surely represent only a small proportion of all those who once lived and labored for their town. The presence of many who performed manual labor and toiled in publicly owned industries, the presence of them is lost to us because they never had the means to leave their mark and inscription. And again, even a commemoration of a simple inscription in the Roman world is a mark of some wealth. So the case to be made here is a bit more complex than this, but it will suffice to say that in the communities where the evidence can be evaluated, the Familia was largely shut out from existing avenues of social and economic mobility via this all-important associative milieu. So, how did they cope with this shortfall? Well, fortunately, a close reading of their activities and behaviors in the inscriptional evidence provides one possible answer. Now, with the time that I have left here, I want to take you through my own analysis of the evidence and steer you toward a likely explanation for this. So again, just to quickly sum up, I think we have a pretty good handle on what it means to be a municipal freedman in Roman society, and this importance of being in associations to sort of give one a civic identity, a place in society, and planning ahead for their future. Yeah. So I proposed above that the evidence from most towns supports this model of very limited social and economic advancement for members of the Familia Publica. Rather than focusing on this point, as past research has done, a more productive approach is to examine more closely what the epigraphic evidence has to say about the internal organization and functions of the Familia Publica itself. Evidence from several towns across the Roman Empire shows members using their organization to stage a range of collective social activities and interact with each other and the wider community. Notably, these activities occur or seem to occur outside the scope of the Familia's official role of performing services for their town. These behaviors are best understood through the lens of the aforementioned all-important professional and voluntary associations that remained out of reach for most of them. And just to kind of signal this, I think for the sake of interest of my time here, I think I'll leave out the number 4 here, which is the commensal activities. There's a slide there, but I think the point is well enough illustrated, I think, by the other 4. Okay, so a first, and I'm here on number 1 here with civic identity. A useful first line of inquiry into the civic identity expressed by various local familiae, and to interpret how this identity was received by others in the community. At least 19 inscriptions can be identified in which the collective Familia Publica, or its smaller subsections, are found operating outside their official capacity. In these, the Familia laid claim to the specific language of associations to describe their group. A couple of examples can be singled out here. One comes from the port of Ostia. You see it here on your screen, where a freedman of the colony dedicated a statue of Mars to his associates, referring to them as the Corpus Familiae Publicae. Familiae Publicae Libertorum Servorum. Evidence from Venafrum, which is a small town just south of Rome, sheds additional light on the use of this type of terminology. Dated the 1st century, the first 3 lines of a fragmentary text on a stele can be read as Collegio Familiae Publicae. The Collegio, inscribed in large letters in the first line, as you can see here in the fragment that's remaining, inscribed in larger letters in the first line, should probably be interpreted as the indirect object, and Familiae Publicae as the genitive of possession dependent on it. A dedicator or a list of dedicators as the subject, therefore, probably would have followed the missing portion on the stone below line 3. It would therefore would have read something like so and so dedicated this monument to the association of the Familia Publica. But again, that very specific language, collegium. On the other side of this equation, the epigraphy also provides insight into how the wider community could perceive the Familia Publica in a civic context. At Ostia, again, an outsider's perspective is offered by the son of Gnaeus Sentius Felix, a member of the local elite who erected a statue with a long inscription enumerating his father's prolific patronage activities in the early 2nd century. This is the inscription. I haven't given you the text. It's a very long text and has a lot of extra details, mostly just a list. But here is an image of it on the right. And among the various professional and voluntary associations that received his father's generosity was the Corpus Libertorum et Servorum Publicorum, the Association of the Public Freedmen and Slaves. Remarkably, the organization of the colony's slaves and ex-slaves seems to be placed on an equal footing with more than a dozen other local associations, including some of the more elite professional associations in Ostia that were connected to the shipment of grain and other maritime commercial activities. Really important groups. The second short phrase that I've given you here on the slide, this is from an honorific inscription from Forum Clodii in northern Italy, and it offers another, albeit less straightforward example. The town's enslaved familia seem to have been on the receiving end of public largesse when a member of the local elite named Lucius Cascellius Probus celebrated his election to high office in the year 165 CE by dedicating a statue of the protective deity of the town, its Ganius, and staging a public banquet with gifts for attendees. Very Roman behavior. The list of recipients in descending order with regard to amount of gifts included the town's patrons, probably senators, Roman senators, the local councilors, and the ministeria publica, along with the citizens of the town. And I've given you that section here, for those of you in Latin, this is the dative of the gift that they received. Since it occurs in a list of civic groups and the setting of a banquet, the phrase ministeria publica probably corresponds to a group of people, probably a subsection of the familia, or maybe this is just how the local town referred to their municipal slaves and freedmen. So there's also some textual evidence in support of this idea to identify the ministeria publica as referring to the public slaves. Now, these examples establish a pattern of current and former municipal enslaved groups framing their civic identity through the appropriation of the typical vocabulary of Roman collegia, perhaps in imitation of the associations they saw all around them. Leaving aside questions of identifying a legal or informal collegium, this pattern reveals the sort of collective ideology that gave solidarity to civic groups and conditioned their self-identity. Laying claim to the terminology shows them acting like an association, and the wider public of their towns seems to have reciprocated by treating the Familia Publica as a distinct group, which serves as a tacit confirmation that the familiae were successful in publicly projecting this sort of a mentality. Okay, another feature of the Familia Publica's collective behaviors, which is shared with formal civic associations, is an internal hierarchy. The presence of collegial magistrates and rank and file members was a primary feature of Roman corporate bodies, and the epigraphic patrimony of sites like Ostia and Puteoli sometimes provides a detailed view of membership roles. Such a hierarchy and some degree of shows some degree of administrative activities within the group, and this demands personnel to manage these things. And again, I have an example that I don't have on a slide for us, so maybe I'll just omit this for now. But suffice to say that, as I mentioned before, in the context of formal collegia that we know about, that were recognized by the Roman state, we find groups passing bylaws, electing officers and having the full range of kind of like a community within a community, and kind of like imitating what they see the actual municipal administration doing. So in terms of the Familia, an instructive case comes from Cordoba in southern Spain, where a current slave of the colony erected the following epitaph for a freedman around the beginning of the 2nd century. The career of Aulus Publicius Germanus, here is the dedicatee, reveals his likely role in an internal hierarchy of the Familia Publica Association in this community. He held the position of perpetual priest within the college, and you can see there the phrase sacerdoti perpetuo, and twice occupied its most senior office of magister, probably best interpreted as maybe something like president of the little group. His office holding record indicates that this Familia college performed cultic activities and even separated supervision of those duties from the administrative functions. The practice is widely known in the large professional associations in Roman towns, such as the associations of builders and textile dealers. The reference to Publicius's 2 terms as magister reveals that annual offices also existed within the Familia of Cordoba, and that these were no doubt acquired through some sort of an internal election or maybe some sort of appointment procedure. This practice was also an imitation of established professional and voluntary associations. The fact that both offices were unconnected to whatever official position this Publicius occupied in the Familia Publica, his day job, if you will, is confirmed by this same titulature. It makes very little sense for any position among the official services of the municipal enslaved and freedmen to be held in perpetuity, or to be attained through internal election or appointment. Rather, these were assigned by the owners or the town council itself, if that were the case. One other point on this tombstone: Publicius's service as the lifetime priest suggests that the Familia Publica could provide its members an outlet to express their religious identity in the public sphere. In the Familia Publica of other towns, we find group venerations directed at the Ganius of the town, the sort of tutelary deity of the town, or its counselors, which duly filled the role of a municipal patron deity. Aside from any religiosity, the presence of cultic activities in the Familia speaks to a strong sense of group identity and solidarity. A third important function of any Roman collegia was prioritizing members' burial rights. This function was so prevalent that past scholars sometimes regarded the burial society or collegium funeraticum as a discrete type of association. But as Jinyu Liu has proposed, in addition to practical considerations, the practice of burial and performance of funerary rituals fostered this collective identity and a sense of belonging to the group. The Familia Publica Association satisfied this collegial need for its members as well. A pair of epitaphs from 2 different Roman towns allow us to say something about these activities. And in both cases here, these are fairly terse texts for the most part, but we can see here that either members of the Familia itself or the groups collectively were dedicating funerary monuments for each other. Again, we can't say whether the individuals who were receiving the monuments simply didn't have families of their own, perhaps a spouse, which is the most common behavior in this case, if one has one, or if being dedicated by the Familia Publica held some sort of greater degree of prestige. We can't fully say that, but what we can say is that the function of this type of internal function of the Familia is present. And again, we see this is common behavior among, as I said, the more formalized associations in the Roman society, as well as also something we see in the households of enslaved people in big senatorial households in Rome and other places. And there's a lot of evidence for this if people would like to ask about it. Okay. Now, this is an even more interesting set of inscriptions that I'll run you through very quickly for this section. This type of evidence for communal burial spaces among known municipal and enslaved members is hard to come by. And what I mean here is that I've speculated a little bit that there could be even collective communal graveyards, if you will, sections within cemeteries in the Roman towns. In the bigger associations and in private slave households, we know this, what are called columbaria, which are these very large vaulted tombs, which have niches for all the family members and so on and so forth. And so we have no hard and fast evidence for this among municipal slaves and freedmen, but it is worth considering that this type of a scenario, having a physical burial structure, may lie behind a pair of funerary monuments from Calais in Noricum. Both inscriptions appear to date to the late 1st or early 2nd century. The collocation of so many of Calais' enslaved and one formerly enslaved men in these two inscriptions may signal the presence of multiple tombs of family members, of members of the Familia Publica. The first text, which is A here, consisting of 74 letters, is inscribed on a marble plaque, but the inscription in B is now lost. So we're really dealing with this first one here, and there's an image there of the actual stone, what's left of it. So based on this surviving example, these inscriptions seem to have been too large to fit inside the confines of a typical columbarium tomb. Instead, they may have designated a set of collective tombs that were part of a collegial graveyard. The direction of the text of inscription A points to a copious monument, which would fit this same scenario. Although it is unknown whether these two tombs actually stood in close proximity to each other, the exclusive Familia affiliation, similar syntactical composition, and putative dating of both inscriptions supports the idea that they were integrated into a constellation of tombs. It is also interesting to note that epitaph A seems to record two separate burials, denoted by two occurrences of the abbreviation here, this HSE, this hic situs est, here lies so-and-so. Text A's editor, Reinhold Vedanig, noted that the lettering in lines 7 to 9 is slightly larger than the rest of the text and lacks the accent marks over the ethnonymic Caleanorum in line 2, possibly denoting a secondary inscription. What I mean by that is the original inscription, whoever the original deceased person, the Successus was, in fact, the first Successus, very common name. This person might have been buried with the stone, and then subsequently another burial, and then another inscription added to the actual stone. So such an addition, if this were the case, if we have a secondary burial, secondary inscription, such an addition would argue for a secondary burial and indicate that the tomb itself was intended for ongoing usage, to be updated with new name entries as needed. Now, one counter argument could be that these men had no spouses or children to erect an epitaph for them, inducing them to pool their resources together, independent of any association. But given their advanced ages, it is difficult to believe that all 7 of them lacked families. The characterization of these as collective tombs of the Familia Publica in many ways offers a more satisfactory explanation. In this case, the social stature that could accrue from securing a spot in the burial plot may well have been owned by the group was probably more important than any other factors. Now, I mentioned before that the commensal activities, I think I'm going to omit this now just in the interest of time. But suffice to say that part of being in a collegium was engaging in a whole calendar of events, which included feasting and banqueting. And the most important examples of this are being seen to banquet in Roman, in public in Roman towns. So someplace in the forum or in some sort of collegium headquarters, or even in a temple complex or something like that. And so we actually can infer from some of the evidence that the Familia Publica might have been doing some of this same sort of public dining. And there's a lot of scholarship dealing with the way public dining is reinforcing of civic identity and group solidarity and things like this. And again, this is a bit more speculative at this stage, but there is some, again, indirect evidence that the Familia Publica may have been engaged in these sorts of things. Okay, so I'll turn to my last feature here. So number 5 on our list here, common treasury or arca communis. So you will see that in this case, I've kind of buried the lead to some extent, and I've done so deliberately. This is in many ways the strongest evidence, I think, for my case. But I think it becomes even more convincing by building up to it with the other features that I've already discussed. Specifically, I want to explore this feature, so this arca communis, with a 2nd century CE inscription from the town of Ameria in southern Umbria. The prominent professional association of textile dealers erected a statue for an elite local woman who had become its benefactor. In return, she distributed cash gifts to association members and set aside money for them to stage an annual banquet commemorating her birthday. The inscription that adorned the statue is now lost, but through early transcriptions of it, we can see that the text celebrated the endowment and left an enduring reminder of the association's financial and social obligations, according to the trust. This inscription has drawn the attention of scholars for what it reveals about the various social activities and privileges participation in any Roman association afforded to members, and the internal dynamics that govern the acquisition of patrons and the internal management of endowments. While the oergotism, or sort of public benefaction, of Julia Felicitas, along with her leading position in a local cultic association, is cited as a prime example of the civic role aristocratic women played in municipal society. But for now, let's unpack this inscription for what it can tell us about our topic. The theme comes from the final lines of the text, which I've given us here in bold and blue font. Final lines of the text, which have been almost entirely overlooked. And it says here, "But if the distribution shall not have been celebrated on the stipulated day, the entire sum is to belong to the Familia Publica." Now, Julia used this common provision to ensure that the textile dealers, the primary recipients of this endowment, would carry out her legacy as prescribed. Donors in local communities knew that local associations had to compete for the financial gain and social prestige that accrued from recruiting and keeping a patron, and savvy donors knew how to exploit this competition. We cannot say for sure why this elite woman designated her town's Familia Publica as an alternative recipient of her wealth, nor do we know whether the Familia ever benefited from this generosity. But the main point I want to make here from this text is that her designation of the Familia Publica opens up new possibilities for understanding the Familia's internal organization and wider role in Amerian society. First, Julia's regard for the Familia was an implicit acknowledgement that it occupied a distinctive place within the same associative milieu in Ameria as the Association of Textile Dealers, one of the most epigraphically visible and lucrative professional occupations in this part of Italy. Second, it can be inferred from the text that she envisioned the funds going into an arca, or treasury, of the Familia, just as she had for the other group. And when she says above, and on top of this, she put into their treasury 5,000 sesterces. The possibility that the Familia at Ameria maintained its own treasury thus begs the question of why they, as a collective, were set up to receive legacies and how they would spend such capital. On the face of it, each feature prompts us to rethink the idea that the Familia only functioned as a crew of current and formerly enslaved laborers who performed services for their town. The literary compilations of Roman law are useful here. The jurist Gaius claims at one point in his writings that the possession of a common treasury, an arca communis, was fundamental to an association's recognition as a proper corporate body. And this is in Book 3 of the Digest. This, in turn, points to the need for association officials to oversee this treasury, So a standardized apparatus along the lines of what we've already been seeing, sort of ranks and different offices. It must not be forgotten that behind the performance of all the activities outlined above, dedications, staging banquets, burying and honoring deceased members, was the need for this type of common fund. Another law dating to the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the later 2nd century makes clear that recognized formal associations were able to receive funds as a group rather than this technical workaround of giving money directly to individual members. Now, as Jinyu Liu has pointed out, this type of imperial legislation was usually intended to formalize already existing practices that were on the ground. Now, this seems to resonate with our case in Ameria. And the jurist Paulus tells us that patrons who gave legacies to illegally formed associations could actually be penalized. So why would a woman of Julia's social standing, not to mention being the wife of a local magistrate, run the risk of discharging an improper endowment? The better explanation is that her generosity fell securely in a legal context. She arranged for the money to be left to the Familia Publica not as individual servi and liberti, but as a recognized corporate body in possession of a legal personality. Okay. So I think I'll wrap things up here. So these examples from individual familiae publicae insinuate a model of associative behavior that closely resembles the one ascribed to Roman professional, trade, and voluntary, as well as associations, as well as some household collegia in the Roman world. While it is uncertain how widely applicable this model was in towns throughout the Roman Empire, the fragments of evidence can be brought together to reconstruct a mosaic that shows active civic groups operating outside the confines of their official capacity in service to the administration. These organizations, moreover, apparently catered to the heterogeneous collegial needs of their members. One explanation for these collective behaviors is that this is simply what so-called servile groups did within their household, particularly urban elite familiae. It thus would have been natural for current and former municipal slaves to exploit their household organization, the Familia Publica, to meet a wider set of needs for social and economic interaction. Yet the evidence for the structural features of the Familia communities in many of these towns gestures to something more systematic, I think. Many of them developed a more comprehensive set of functions than the typical private household and evidently found a receptive audience in the municipal environment. At least some familiae publicae achieved a prominent position within the civic milieu, as we've seen in these fragments of evidence. Now, it remains to pin down why the familia associations developed as they seem to have done. We've already seen that former municipal slaves were, for the most part, poorly integrated into the recognizable social and economic venues that urban associations offered to ex-slaves. I think probably their lack of a personal patron and the corresponding benefits that accrued to private freedmen and freedwomen surely hindered their prospects for upward mobility. In this context, it makes sense that the Familia developed as an association because it was the best many of them could hope to attain. Yet more than being a viable alternative to other colleges, an argument can be made that the Familia was a desirable and profitable destination. The social activities of the Familia indicate a measure of wealth, and there was likely an element of prestige attached to it, given its official links to the local elite in the Council of Decurions. Now, also, the model advanced here does not demand membership in the Familia Association had to be exclusive. Some municipal slaves and ex-slaves could and probably did belong to other social groups while still interacting with their home group. In addition to the social interaction, one of the primary aims of Roman associative life, particularly for the ex-slaves, was for a member to make social and economic connections and put his name in the public eye in the hope of laying the groundwork for the social advancement of his freeborn sons. The Familia Association may have provided a convenient outlet for just such ambitions, and one should not dismiss the value of pooling resources to that end among former slaves who didn't have a personal patron. So this study of the Familia Publica brings a fresh perspective of the inchoate processes behind the formation of civic communities in the Roman world. It offers insight into a group of slaves and ex-slaves who may have held some status within municipal society, yet very few of whom were able to advance within the existing associative structures in their towns. As a response to this lack of purchase in society, they relied on their own institution as an avenue into the local associative landscape and as a pathway toward upward social mobility. The fact that we have the evidence we do attests to the success of some of these familiae publicae in promoting this civic identity. A focus on this associative dimension of the familia prompts us to rethink its civic status and shines new light on the group's important role as an institutional link between the elite and subaltern populations in Roman municipal society. Now, I want to make one final point here, and then I'll wrap things up. The history of slavery has always occupied a central place in civic discourse, particularly here in the United States. But of late, the institution has received more attention, mostly for the wrong reasons. And I'm sure many of you are very well aware of this. We now hear disconcertingly often at the highest levels of public discourse attempts to downplay and create counter-narratives of the atrocities and enduring impact enslavement had on its victims and their descendants. Even among Roman historians, there have been attempts to characterize slavery as a transitory state, a sort of long-term contract, or simply a form of indentured servitude where manumission was almost automatic. Regarding manumitted men and women, the focus has largely been on their legal position and how they fit into the economic networks of their masters turned patrons. The common notion of how social mobility was supposed to work, common notions of this have predominated. Freedmen were supposed to forge a middling economic class and accumulate their own small fortunes. Although being barred from holding public office themselves, the ambitious freedmen kept their eye on advancing the careers of their freeborn sons and grandsons, who could pursue a full public career by virtue of their free birth. Libertinitas was only a transient state for the family. The ideal outcome was for these newcomers to be fully absorbed into free society and for a select few eventually to advance into the local or imperial aristocracy. They were supposed to be like that man Lucius Sipinius Oriens we met at the outset of the paper, or even the outrageously wealthy but uncouth Trimalchio, the fictional freedman in Petronius's novel Satirica, which many of you probably know. So again, I think it's important to push back against these ameliorating views of slavery as a temporary or a less harsh condition, and in the Roman context, against positive notions of a sort of a prosperous and consciously proud freedman class. Manumission was a far more complex process, and it did not always put ex-slaves and their descendants on the straight and narrow path of upward mobility. Thank you very much for your attention.